The braking of the stagecoach was a groan of stressed wood and leather, a final surrender to the mud that had been trying to swallow it for the last 10 miles. Clara Whitmore felt the jolt travel up her spine, a spine she had held rigid for 6 days, from the upholstered seats of the Union Pacific line to the hard, splintered bench of the territorial coach. For a moment, she simply sat, the rattling quiet replaced by the howl of a wind that seemed intent on scouring the world clean. She was the last passenger. The 2 prospectors and the whiskey drummer had disembarked at South Pass City, leaving her to the cold mercy of the high plains and the driver's silence. "This is it, ma'am," the driver called from outside, his voice already snatched away by the gale. "Eden Ridge." Clara looked through the mud-caked window. If this was Eden, she pitied Adam. The town was little more than a single, wide scar of mud flanked by perhaps 24 structures, some of false-fronted pine, others of rough log. A saloon, a general store flying a ripped canvas banner, a livery, and a blacksmith shop seemed to be the only places breathing. The wind, coming hard from the mountains still buried in white, carried the smell of wet soot, manure, and the sharp, lonely scent of pine. She gathered her reticule, her gloved fingers stiff. She would not cry. She had made that promise in a gaslit Boston parlor. Watching her father strike her name from the family Bible, crying was a weakness, a luxury for women who still had something to lose. Clara had only her name, and even that was sullied. She pushed open the coach door. The wind hit her instantly, plastering her heavy woolen traveling skirt to her legs and stealing the breath from her lungs. She stepped down, her fine leather boot sinking 3 inches into the freezing mire. The cold was a physical thing, a slap that brought unwelcome color to her pale cheeks. The driver hauled her single, small trunk from the boot and dropped it beside her with a wet thud. It contained everything her mother had slipped her: 2 day dresses, a set of linens, her journals, and a small pouch of coins that was now distressingly light. "He'll be here," the driver grunted, avoiding her eyes as he accepted his payment. "Man like Mercer, he keeps his word." He climbed back onto his seat, and with a crack of the whip, the coach lumbered away, leaving Clara Whitmore standing alone in the main street of Eden Ridge, Wyoming territory, an exhibit for the curious. The whispers started immediately. She did not need to hear the words to know their shape. She saw them in the eyes of the woman who paused sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. She saw them in the faces of the 3 men who stopped their game of checkers, visible through the saloon's grimy window. Runaway, Boston, scandal, Whitmore. She knew what they saw. A woman too fine for this place. Her coat well made, though spattered with filth. Her bonnet secured with a pin that was likely real silver. They saw a problem shipped west, a piece of damaged goods being passed on. She lifted her chin, her posture, drilled into her by a governess long since dismissed, was the only armor she had left. She would not slump. She would not tremble, though the cold was biting deep. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. The wind tore at her bonnet ribbons. She was becoming a spectacle, a statue of Eastern disgrace. Then, a man detached himself from the shadows of the livery. He moved without hurry, his steps sure in the mud that had nearly claimed her boot. He was tall, as the letters had promised, and lean. He wore denim trousers tucked into worn boots, a sheepskin-lined jacket, and a hat pulled low, its brim stained with sweat and snow. He stopped a few feet from her, pushing his hat back just enough. Clara had prepared herself for a brute, a hard man eager for the wife he had purchased through correspondence. This man was quiet. His face was weathered, sun-darkened to the color of old leather, and marked by a thin, white scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He seemed awkward, his large, gloved hands hanging at his sides as if he did not know where to put them. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to fight the wind. "Mr. Mercer," she replied. Her own voice was tight, brittle. He looked at her, and his eyes were not what she expected. They were not leering, like the men in the saloon, nor were they cold. They were a pale, clear gray, and they seemed to see everything: the exhaustion, the fear, and the pride she wore like a shield. He saw the tremble in her hands she was trying so desperately to hide. He saw the truth. It unnerved her more than any insult could have. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Silas," he called over his shoulder. A younger man, wiry and chewing on a piece of straw, emerged from the livery. "This here's the trunk," Wade Mercer said, his gaze shifting to the mud-soaked luggage. "Take it to the pastor's office, then wait with the horses." The ranch hand named Silas gave Clara a long, skeptical look. It was a look she knew well, a measuring glance that tallied her up and found her wanting. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud near her feet, hoisted the trunk, and moved off. "The pastor is waiting," Wade said to her. Not an invitation, but a statement of fact. He did not offer her his arm. He simply turned and began walking toward a small building at the end of the street, trusting she would follow. Clara, pulling her skirts from the mud, did. The wedding was a mockery. The pastor's office, attached to his small, cluttered cabin, smelled of stale whiskey, unwashed wool, and fried bacon. The pastor himself was a short, florid man with watery eyes and a tremor in his hands. He was, Clara realized with a fresh wave of cold dread, drunk. It was perhaps 11 o'clock in the morning. "Mr. Mercer," the pastor slurred, beaming. "And the bride." Wade Mercer merely nodded, placing a small coin on the man's desk. The pastor's eyes lit, and he snatched it up. "Right then. Let us get to it. A holy union, a blessed thing." He fumbled with a dog-eared book, knocking a half-empty bottle over. Wade steadied it with a swift, economical movement before the contents could spill. Silas, the ranch hand, stood in the corner by the door, his hat held respectfully in his hands, but his expression was one of deep, cynical amusement. He was the only witness. "Stand here," the pastor instructed, waving them closer to the desk. "Join hands." Clara stared at Wade's ungloved hand. It was large, the knuckles scarred, the nails clipped short. It was a hand that knew labor, a hand that was worlds away from the soft, pale hands of the men she had known in Boston. Hesitantly, she placed her own gloved hand into his. His grip was firm, dry, and surprisingly warm. The pastor began to read, stumbling over the words. "Dearly beloved, we gather in this place to join this man, Wade, and this woman." He squinted at Clara. "Marla?" "Clara," she whispered. The humiliation was a hot flush on her neck. "Clara, aye, a fine name, a fine day." He skipped several pages. "Do you, Wade Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, till death do you part?" "I do," Wade said. His voice was steady, resonant in the small room. "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" Clara felt the room tilt. This was the transaction, finalized. This was the end of Clara Whitmore and the beginning of, what, a life sentence. She looked at the drunk pastor, at the smirking ranch hand, at the silent, scarred man whose hand held hers. She could not speak. She could only nod, a short, jerky motion. "Splendid," the pastor declared, slamming the book shut. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife. You may, he waved a hand. "You may kiss the bride." Wade did not move. He simply continued to look at her with those unsettling, quiet eyes. He seemed to understand that a kiss here, in this room, would be an act of violence, not affection. After a beat of heavy silence, he released her hand and turned to Silas. "Bring the horses round front." Silas nodded, his smirk deepening, and left the room. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," the pastor said, already reaching for his bottle. Clara felt the name land on her like a shroud. She turned, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest, and walked out of the office into the biting wind. A married woman. The ride to the homestead was 2 hours of freezing misery. Wade had procured a second horse for her, a placid, heavy-footed mare that seemed as tired as she felt. He helped her mount, his hands impersonal on her waist, lifting her as if she were a sack of flour. Then he mounted his own horse, a tall roan, and set off, leading her horse by a rope. They left the sad cluster of buildings behind, moving out onto the plains. The land was vast, an ocean of brown grass bent flat by the wind, broken by patches of stubborn, melting snow. The sky was a bruised or oppressive gray, skeletal trees, cottonwoods and aspens, huddled by the thin ribbon of a creek, their branches rattling like bones. Wade did not speak, not once. The only sounds were the plodding of the hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the incessant, screaming wind that tore through her coat and chilled her to the bone. She shivered, her teeth chattering, but she said nothing. She clenched her jaw, focusing on the broad, steady back of the man in front of her. He was her husband. The thought was absurd. She had been raised for a different life, a life of drawing rooms, of poetry, of quiet afternoons playing Chopin on the pianoforte. It was that piano, and the tutor her father had hired, that had destroyed her. Nathaniel Keats. He had spoken of poetry, too, and his hands had been soft, his words beautiful, and those beautiful words had hidden a casual cruelty that had left her pregnant, shamed, and utterly alone. The baby, a girl, had been stillborn, a cold, blue thing that had taken Clara's last hopes with it. Her family, suffocated by the scandal, had banished her. This marriage was her father's final solution, a transactional arrangement with a stranger out west, a rancher who needed a wife to satisfy the terms of his mother's will, a man who, clearly, was not particular about the quality of the goods. Clara shivered again, a violent, bone-deep tremor. This cold was nothing compared to the ice in her soul. She would rather die fighting, she thought bitterly, than live running. But she was not fighting, she was just running, and she had finally run out of world. Just as she thought she could not endure another minute, he stopped. "We're here," he said, turning in his saddle. She looked up. There was nothing, just a slight rise, a cluster of dark rocks, and more gray sky. Then she saw it, tucked into the lee of the hill, almost invisible. It was a cabin, lonely, as the outline had suggested, was too small a word. It was desolate. It seemed not so much built as clawed from the earth. It was made of rough-hewn pine logs, chinked with mud, and had a low, sloping roof. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. Beside it stood a small, ramshackle barn and a corral holding 3 cows and the roan's companion horse. This was her home. He dismounted and came to her side. "You're stiff. Give me your hands." She did, and he practically lifted her from the saddle. Her legs buckled, numb from the cold and the ride. He steadied her, his grip strong on her arm, holding her upright until she found her balance. He did not release her until he was sure she would not fall. "Silas left the trunk inside," he said, moving toward the cabin. Clara followed, her body aching. The first night was defined by silence. The cabin was one room, larger than she'd expected, but stark. A cast-iron stove in one corner radiated a welcome, if insufficient, heat. A rough plank table with 2 chairs sat in the middle. Against the far wall was a single bed, a simple frame with a quilt thrown over it. A rifle was mounted over the door. The place was clean but bare, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. Wade moved with quiet purpose. He stoked the fire, his back to her, and filled a kettle with water from a bucket. He did not ask her to help. He did not seem to expect anything from her at all. Clara stood by the door, her coat still on, her fingers frozen. She felt like a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong address. "Supper," he said, gesturing to the table. He had prepared a stew earlier, and it bubbled in a pot on the stove. He ladled it into 2 tin bowls and sliced a heel of dark bread. They sat opposite each other. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the scraping of their spoons and the constant, maddening howl of the wind outside. Clara could barely eat. Each bite felt like swallowing sawdust. She was intensely aware of him. He ate slowly, steadily, his eyes on his bowl. He was not a brute. He was contained. When they were finished, he took her bowl, washed it in a basin, and dried it. He motioned to the bed. "That's yours," he said. Clara stared at him. "And you?" "I've got a bedroll." He retrieved it from a chest, along with another thick blanket. He spread it on the floor near the stove, as far from the bed as the small room would allow. He turned his back, giving her privacy, and began to unbutton his jacket. Clara, her heart pounding a sick, fast rhythm, quickly moved to the bed. She did not undress, could not even bring herself to remove her boots. She simply lay on top of the quilt and pulled her coat tighter, her back to the room. She heard him bank the fire for the night, heard the rustle as he settled into his bedroll. Then, silence again. She lay awake, rigid, every nerve screaming. She was waiting for the touch she feared, the inevitable claiming of the husband's right, this restraint, this politeness. It was confusing. It was a lie. Men were not like this. Nathaniel had not been like this. He had been all soft words and softer hands until the door was locked. And then his demands had been iron. This man, Wade, was built of iron. Yet he slept on the floor. It made no sense. This kindness felt more threatening than cruelty. It was a game she did not understand. An hour passed. The fire died to embers. The cold of the room seeped into the bed. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls, whistling a low, mournful tune, and in that cold, dark silence, Clara Whitmore finally broke. It was not a loud breakdown. It was a silent shattering. The numbness that had protected her dissolved, and the full, crushing weight of her reality landed on her. She was 20 years old. She was ruined. She was married to a stranger. She was thousands of miles from anything she had ever known. She was trapped in a cold, dark room with a man she did not know, on a wedding night that was a funeral for her life. She hated her father. She hated Nathaniel, but most of all, she hated herself. She was weak. She was a coward. She had been passed along, a shameful secret, and now she was this man's burden. A desperate, ugly thought took root. She had one thing left, one thing she understood. The currency that had ruined her was the only currency she possessed. If she was his property, she would prove she was not useless property. If she was weak, she would perform the only act of strength she had left. She would choose the moment of her surrender. Her hands shaking so violently she could barely control them. She sat up. The room was almost black, lit only by the faint red glow from the stove's vent. She could just make out his shape on the floor, a long mound under the blankets. She slid off the bed. Her boots made no sound on the wooden floor. He was not asleep. She knew it. She felt his stillness. She reached him, her shadow falling over him. She knelt by his bedroll. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered, her voice cracking. He did not move, but she knew he was awake. "Wade. Wade." She fumbled with the top button of her own coat, her fingers numb and clumsy. I know what is required. I am not weak." She was trying to prove it. To him, to herself. She was trying to seduce him, to get the awful transaction over with, to prove she had something to offer. Her hand, shaking, moved to the buttons of her dress beneath the coat. It was a desperate, pathetic gesture, a pantomime of intimacy learned from trauma. Suddenly, his hand closed over hers. It stopped her cold. His hand was large, calloused, and radiated a startling heat. It covered her own cold, trembling fingers, pinning them against the wool of her coat. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough with sleep, or something else. Shame, hot and absolute, washed over her. She had failed again. Even at this, she tried to pull her hand away, but his grip was gentle and firm. I am sullied," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. "I know I am not what you wanted, but this is all I am." She was admitting she was worthless, a body and nothing more. He was silent for a long moment. The wind howled, rattling the single window. She thought he might strike her, or laugh. Instead, He slowly sat up, bringing his hand, still covering hers, between them. He did not let go. With his other hand, he reached out in the dark and touched her chin, tilting her face toward him. She could not see his eyes, but she felt their weight. He spoke one sentence, his voice quiet, scraping the silence. "Size isn't everything, is it?" The words hung in the air. Clara froze. It was a strange, nonsensical thing to say. A crude jest? No, the way he said it, it was not a joke. It was a question, and it was aimed at the very heart of her self-loathing. She had been talking about her body, her virtue, her worth. She had been telling him her soul was small, ruined, incomplete, and he had heard her. He was not talking about her body. He was talking about her heart. He was talking about the scale of her pain, the weight of her past. He was challenging the judgment that had condemned her, the voices that told her she was small and broken, the kindness of it, the simple, profound understanding from this stranger in the dark, shattered the last of her defenses. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ugly sound she had refused to make for months. It was not a cry of shame. It was a cry of release. The tears she had sworn never to shed came in a hot, painful rush. She doubled over, pulling her hand from his to cover her face. Wade did not shush her. He did not comfort her with empty words. He simply waited, letting the storm break. When the first violent sobs quieted to ragged, shuddering breaths, he acted. He took the heavy quilt from the bed he had given her. He did not tell her to get back in it. Instead, he wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her down, not onto his bedroll, but next to it, her back against the crude chest. Then he sat beside her, fully clothed, and pulled the other blanket over them both, tucking it around her feet. He did not touch her again. He just sat there, a solid, warm presence in the freezing dark. They sat together, side by side, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the cabin walls. After a long time, her shivers began to ease, replaced by the heavy exhaustion of a battle finally lost. Her head drooped, her body leaning instinctively toward the warmth. They slept, fully clothed, huddled under rough quilts on the floor, husband and wife, two strangers anchored against the vast, lonely dark. When Clara woke, it was not to the howling wind, but to the sound of dripping water. The cold in the cabin was sharp, but the suffocating silence of the night before had fractured. She was on the floor, stiff and aching. The heavy quilt pooled around her. The other blanket was gone. She sat up, her head thick. Across the small room, Wade Mercer was already stoking the stove. He had his jacket on and his hat in his hand. He had given her the quilt and taken the chill for himself. He did not acknowledge her waking immediately. He finished settling the wood, then poured coffee from a pot into a tin mug. He set a second mug on the table for her. "The snow is pulling back," he said, his voice low. "The creeks will be running high. I'll be on the north range, checking the fences." He drank his coffee standing, black and scalding. He looked at her, his gaze brief, assessing. He was checking for breakage. She realized, just as he would check his fences. "There is flour in the bin," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Bacon hanging in the smokehouse out back. The hens are in the small coop by the barn. If they've laid." He put on his hat, pulled his gloves tight, and took his rifle from the pegs above the door. And then he was gone. The door shut with a solid, quiet click, leaving her alone in the cabin that was supposed to be her home. Clara sat for a long time, the forgotten mug of coffee growing cold. She was sore, exhausted, and humiliated by her breakdown. She had wept like a child, and he had done nothing. He had simply sat with her. It was more confusing than the cruelty she had braced for. Spring, in this high country, was not a gentle unfolding of green. It was a brutal, muddy battle. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly. The land was a sea of brown, gray, and weeping ice. The wind never stopped. Wade lived by the rhythm of the reluctant sun. He was gone before light, riding the perimeter of his land. He was mending what the winter had broken. Fences were pulled down by the weight of drifts. posts snapped by the frost. He returned after dark, covered in mud and sweat, smelling of wet wool and cold air. He would eat in the same steady silence, mend a piece of tack by the fire, and then unroll his bedroll on the floor. He never asked her about her night. He never referenced her tears. He acted as if they had simply sat by the fire, two strangers sharing warmth. Clara, in turn, retreated into the space he allotted her. The cabin was her fence line. She began to clean, driven by a desperate need for order, for control. She scrubbed the floors, scoured the pots, and washed the single window until the weak spring light could pierce the grime. She aired the bedding, though the air outside was hardly fresh. When the cleaning was done, she turned to the 3 books she had brought, a volume of Shakespeare, a collection of poems by Miss Barrett, and her leather-bound journal. She read until her eyes burned, the words a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. At night, by the fire, she would write in her journal, her fingers stiff. She wrote about the sound of the wind. She wrote about the color of the mud. She never wrote about Wade. She tried to make herself useful. She was not a fool. She knew this arrangement was one of mutual burden. He had given her his name and his protection. She was expected to earn her keep, but she was a creature of parlors, her hands soft, her education entirely useless. She tried to make biscuits. The first batch was heavy as lead, scorched on the bottom and raw in the middle. She threw them outside, watching the chickens peck at them with suspicion. Wade found them. He said nothing, but that evening, he brought in the flour sack. "Keep the soda separate till the end," he said, his voice neutral. He measured the flour and lard with his eye, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising delicacy. "The stove runs hot on the left. You turn them once." He showed her, just the one time. He did not criticize her failure. He did not mock her ignorance. He simply showed her the way it was done. The next morning, he left the flour sack on the table. She struggled. Her hands, accustomed to piano keys, were clumsy with an axe. She tried to split kindling and nearly took off a finger, the shock of the metal on the wood vibrating up her arm. Wade found her shaking, the axe buried in the chopping block. He took it from her, reset her grip, and showed her how to let the weight of the head do the work. He trusted her to learn. The trust was a heavier burden than any command. She failed at milking the one cow that was fresh, ending with more on her skirt than in the pail. She burned the beans. She was clumsy, weak, and wholly unsuited for this life. Yet, he never raised his voice. He never criticized. He would just fix it. He would finish the milking or scrape the beans into his own plate and eat them without comment. His patience was a quiet mirror, reflecting her own inadequacy. She felt the gap between them, not as a silence, but as a canyon of experience. He was a man who knew how to survive. She was a woman who had only known how to be. One night, perhaps 3 weeks after her arrival, the tension broke. The day had been long. She had spent hours trying to mend one of Wade's shirts, her stitches small but uneven. He was mending a bridle strap, the leather hissing as he worked the awl. The fire crackled. The wind was low, a mournful sigh. Clara sat on the small stool, having given him the only chair. She had unbound her hair for the night and was pulling her silver-backed brush through it. It was one of the last vestiges of her old life, a heavy, ornate thing. The rhythmic pull of the bristles was soothing. "You are a quiet man," she said, the words surprising her. He didn't look up. He tested the new stitch. No call for much talking. Where are you from?" "This valley. My mother and father built this cabin. They're buried up on the ridge." "You have no other family?" He paused, his hand stilled on the leather. "I had a brother. He's gone." The finality in his tone should have warned her off, but the silence had stretched too long. The confession of her own was scratching at her throat. She needed, suddenly, for him to know why she was so broken, to explain the damaged goods he had received. "I am not a good wife," she whispered, her hand stopping, the brush tangled in her hair. He looked at her then. His gray eyes were clear in the firelight. "I ain't made a complaint. You should." I am not what you paid for. I paid for a wife, Miss Clara. You're here. I am here because I am ruined." The words came out, cold and sharp. "I am here because no one else would have me." He went back to his work, pulling the sinew tight. "Don't matter to me." "It should." She set the brush down, her hands twisting in her lap. "In Boston, I was to be married, to a man my father approved of. But She stopped. He remained silent, listening. The silence was not empty, it was an invitation. It was the space he had given her on that first night. "There was another man," she said, her voice flat. "My piano tutor. His name was Nathaniel. He spoke of poetry. He said he loved me. I was a fool, a naive, lonely fool." She waited for him to react, to show disgust. He just worked the leather. He was not a good man. He was cruel. But I did not see it until it was too late. I found myself in the family way. The silence in the room deepened. Now, only the fire made a sound. "My father was furious. My mother tried to make me drink things. Horrible, bitter things. To fix it. When that did not work, they locked me in my room. They said I was ill with consumption. They were going to send me away, to an aunt in the country." She stared into the flames, seeing the gaslights of her locked room. "The baby came early. It was a girl. She was stillborn." Clara's voice did not crack. "It was a cold, dead thing." This was a story she had told herself 1,000 times in the dark. "After that, I was no longer just a scandal. I was a disgrace. My family, they could not bear the shame of me. My father, he struck my name from the Bible. He banished me. This marriage." She gestured around the rough cabin. "This was his solution, to ship me west, where my sin could not stain his name." She finished. She felt hollowed out, empty. She had laid her entire ugly history at his feet. Wade did not move for a full minute. He finished the stitch, his movements precise, economical. He knotted the sinew and cut it clean with his knife. He finally looked up. His eyes, she saw, were not hard. They were not judgmental. They were, as the outline had promised, shadowed with a grief of his own. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw a man who recognized the shape of loss. He had seen his own ghosts in her story. He did not interrupt. He offered no false comfort. He did not tell her it was all right. He simply nodded. Once. A short, sharp acknowledgement of her truth. He put his mending aside. "It's late," he said, his voice rough. "You should get your sleep." He turned his back, giving her privacy as he always did, and spread his bedroll on the floor. The confession changed the air between them. The polite distance remained, but the awkwardness was gone. It had been replaced by a shared, unspoken knowledge. He knew her worst, and he had not flinched. Their physical world, by necessity, began to overlap. He needed her to help. He was splitting logs for the stove, massive rounds of pine. She was trying to stack them. She reached for a piece at the same time he did. His calloused fingers brushed her bare hand. It was the first time his skin had touched hers since that first night. She flinched, but his hand was just warm, solid. He paused for a second, letting her pull back, but she did not. Their fingers grazed, and he let her take the wood. He decided she needed to know how to ride properly, not just be led like baggage. "If a storm comes up," he said, "or if you see smoke, you ride for town. You don't wait." He put her on the placid mare, but this time, he did not lead her. He stood beside her, adjusting the stirrups. He put his hands on her boot, guiding it. Then, he put his hands on her waist to shift her in the saddle. "Sit straight," he said. "Don't fight the horse. Feel the way it moves." His fingers were firm, spread wide against her ribs. She could feel the strength in them, the controlled power. He was not grabbing her. He was placing her. She was acutely aware of his proximity, the smell of sun and horse on his jacket. He held her there for a moment, and she felt a tremor pass through her, not of fear, but of awareness. He let go and stepped back. "Now," Ride to the creek and back. She did, and for the first time she felt a flicker, not of joy, but of competence. The weather turned. A late, vicious storm blew in from the mountains, bringing not snow, but 3 days of freezing, horizontal rain. The world dissolved back into mud. Clara, driven by her newfound need to be useful, had refused to let the storm stop her. The water bucket was low. Wade was out, trying to drive a few stray cattle back from a rain-swollen gully. She had to pull her own weight. She took the yoke and the 2 wooden buckets and marched into the deluge. The wind tore at her, plastering her thin dress and coat to her skin. The creek was a roaring, brown torrent. She slipped on the bank, falling to her knees in the icy mud, but she filled the buckets. The trip back to the cabin was a nightmare. The water sloshed, the yoke cut into her shoulders, and the cold had seeped into her bones. By the time she stumbled inside, she was shaking so hard she could barely unlatch the door. By nightfall, she was burning. Wade found her huddled by the stove, wrapped in every blanket, her teeth chattering. When he touched her forehead, his hand felt like ice, though his skin was warm. "Fool thing," he muttered. It was the closest he had ever come to criticism. He did not hesitate. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She was too weak to protest as he laid her on the bed, their bed now. He pulled off her wet boots and her sodden outer clothes with an impersonal efficiency, leaving her in her chemise. He covered her with the driest, warmest quilts. For 2 days, Clara drifted in a world of fever. She was back in Boston, her mother's face looming over her, forcing a bitter tea to her lips. She was on the stagecoach, freezing. She heard Nathaniel's voice, whispering poetry, and she cried out. Through it all, a constant, steady presence, a cool cloth on her forehead, replaced the moment it grew warm, the taste of hot, salty broth pressed to her lips. A hand, large and rough, holding hers when the shivers became too violent. The second night, the fever was at its worst. The cold was a living thing, trying to pull her under. She was shaking, convinced she was dying. She felt the bed dip. She felt a solid, human warmth press against her back. An arm, heavy and strong, wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight against a broad chest. She stiffened, a flicker of her old panic rising. "No, be still," Wade's voice rumbled, his breath warm against her hair. "It's the fever. You need the warmth. Be still." He held her. He did not stroke her. He did not whisper comfort. He simply wrapped his body around hers, a human shield against the cold, and held on. She was surrounded by his scent, pine smoke, leather, and the simple, clean smell of a man. Protected, she felt his breathing, slow and steady. In her fevered state, she burrowed against him, and for the first time in her memory, she felt utterly, completely safe. The fever broke on the 3rd morning. She woke to the sound of sizzling bacon and a low, tuneless humming. The cabin was bright with weak sunlight. She was in the bed, alone. She felt weak, scoured out, but the fire in her blood was gone. Wade was at the stove, his back to her. He was humming, a deep, quiet rumble in his chest. It was a sound of absolute solitude, a sound a man makes when he believes no one is listening. Clara lay still, watching him. She saw the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with an economy of motion. She saw the man, not just the cowboy, not just the husband. She saw a man who knew loneliness as deeply as she did, a man who hummed to himself in an empty cabin to fill the silence. Her heart ached, not with fear or gratitude, but with a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. He sensed her watching and turned. Their eyes met. "You're back," he said. "I am," she whispered. He brought her a mug of weak coffee. "Drink this, then you'll eat." The storm passed, and the real spring finally arrived. The tension in the cabin had changed again. He had moved his bedroll back to the floor, but the memory of his arms around her remained. They were intensely aware of each other. The space between them crackled. A week later, another storm rolled in, but this one was all thunder and sound, a warm, violent spring downpour. The cabin felt small, intimate. The rain hammered on the roof, isolating them. They had eaten supper. He was cleaning his rifle. She was reading, but the words blurred. The air was too heavy. He had given her back her life. He had listened to her confession and not judged. He had nursed her and not demanded. He had slept beside her and only protected. She looked at him, the firelight catching the scar on his cheek. He was strong, he was kind, and he was lonely. She put her book down. She stood up. He watched her, his hand stilling on the rifle. She crossed the 3 feet of floor between them, from the bed to his space by the hearth. She knelt in front of him, just as she had on that first terrible night. But this time, there was no fear. There was no desperation. There was only a trembling, urgent need. She put her hand on his knee. He did not move. "Clara," he said, his voice a warning. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was urgent, born of her gratitude and her long dormant hunger for a connection that was not built on pain. It was soft, her lips trembling against the firmness of his. He was still for a second, shocked. Then he responded. His hand came up, not to push her away, but to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. The rifle was forgotten. He kissed her back, and his kiss was not the awkwardness of the stagecoach stop, but a deep, pent-up flood of his own loneliness. It was hesitant, then fierce, then slow. It was imperfect and messy. His stubble scratched her chin. Her hands were clumsy on his shoulders. But it was real. They moved, shifting, until they were half lying on his bedroll, the fire warm on their faces. The kiss deepened. It turned to exploration. His hands moved from her hair to her shoulders, to her waist. It was he who stopped it. When her trembling fingers went to the buttons of her dress, his hand covered hers, just as it had the first night. "Not like this," he breathed, his voice ragged. Not yet." Clara stared at him, confused, afraid she had pushed too far, but there was no rejection in his eyes. There was a raw, aching tenderness. He was protecting her, even from himself. He rolled, sitting up and pulling her with him, so her back was against his chest. He kept one arm loosely around her waist. She was trembling. He took her hand and held it. Then, with his other hand, he slowly, reverently, traced the line of her spine through the thin cotton of her dress. His calloused fingers moved from the nape of her neck, down each vertebra. Learning the shape of her, it was not a lover's caress. It was a cartographer's, mapping new land. He was tracing her, reading her. His touch was like scripture, a silent promise. Clara leaned her head back against his shoulder. A single tear tracked down her cheek, followed by another. She wept, not with the broken sobs of her arrival, but with the quiet, healing tears of a woman who had, against all hope, been found. The quiet between them had shifted. It was no longer a void to be filled, but a space they shared, a soft blanket of understanding. The way he had held her through the storm, the way he had traced her spine as if learning a map, had unlocked something in Clara. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, but it was no longer the only note. A new, fragile chord of want had begun to resonate. She felt it days later. She had taken him his midday meal, a small pail of leftover stew and fresh biscuits. He was not in the cabin or mending the fence line. She heard a sharp snort and the heavy thud of hooves from the barn. She pushed the door open a crack. The barn was thick with heat and the sharp smell of hay, dust, and animal sweat. In the center ring, Wade was fighting a horse. It was a wild thing, a rangy mustang the color of dried blood, its eyes white with terror. It reared, front hooves lashing at the air, its scream echoing in the rafters. And Wade was there, holding the lead rope. He was shirtless. Clara stopped, her hand frozen on the door. She had never seen him this way. The heat of the day and the violence of the work had forced him to strip off his shirt. His skin was sun-darkened, streaked with sweat and dust. stretched taut over the lean, hard muscles of his back and shoulders. The white scar on his face stood out, a stark line of old pain. He was not breaking the horse. She saw that instantly. He was not using a whip, not spurring it, not meeting its panic with his own rage. He was using his body, his weight, and an ocean of impossible patience. The horse lunged. He moved with it, a fluid, powerful dance. He kept the rope taut, turning the horse's energy back on itself, forcing it to circle, to think. He spoke to it, his voice a low, steady rumble she could not make out over the animal's terror. Clara watched, breathless. She watched the coil and release of his muscles. She saw the absolute control he exerted, not just over the horse, but over himself. This was strength, not brutality. This was the man who had held her through a fever, who had listened to her confession and not flinched. He was a man who could gentle a wild thing, not by breaking its spirit, but by showing it a strength it did not have to fear. The horse finally stopped, its sides heaving, its head low. It stood, trembling, but it stood. Wade, breathing hard, slowly approached, hand out, speaking those same low, calm words. He touched the horse's neck. The animal flinched but did not bolt. A profound, aching longing washed through Clara, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was not the girlish flutter she had felt for Nathaniel. This was deeper, heavier. It was a desire for this man, for his quiet, his control, his safety. She wanted the hands that could gentle a Mustang to touch her with that same deliberate, patient strength. She backed away, the pail forgotten, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fled back to the cabin before he could see her. That night, the cabin felt smaller. The fire crackled, a comfortable sound against the chirping of the prairie crickets. They had eaten. He had taken his bedroll by the fire, as was his habit since her recovery. He was checking the sights on his rifle, the metal glinting in the low light. Clara had brushed her hair, her hands shaking slightly. She had put on her nightdress and the thin wrapper. She stood by the bed, the one he had given her. He finished his work and looked up. She was not in the bed. She was just watching him. He saw it in her eyes. The question, the want. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. A warning, or perhaps a question of his own. She did not move to him. She simply untied the ribbon of her wrapper and let it fall from her shoulders. She stood before him in only her thin cotton chemise. She was not posing. She was not performing. It was a surrender, but not one of defeat. He rose from the bedroll. He moved slowly, as he had with the horse. He did not want to spook her. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so tall. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers hesitant, and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed the skin under her eye. "Are you sure?" he whispered. She could not speak. She nodded, leaning her face into his palm. That was all he needed. He did not kiss her. Not yet. He bent and lifted her into his arms. She weighed nothing to him. He carried her the 2 steps to the bed and laid her down on the quilt. Their first time was nothing like the cheap novels she had hidden in Boston, nor the violent, selfish fumbling of her past. It was, as the outline promised, imperfect and messy. It was reverent. He moved slowly. He was clumsy with the buttons of her chemise, and she fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. Their hands met, their fingers tangled. It was awkward, but it was filled with a staggering, unspoken emotion. When he finally touched her, his hands were not the soft, demanding hands of Nathaniel. They were rough. They were the hands that had fixed her biscuits, mended her fences, and held her through a fever. They were the hands that had tamed a wild horse, and he touched her as if she were something sacred, something infinitely fragile. He kissed her, and his kiss was a question, an exploration. He was learning her. He watched her face in the firelight, his gray eyes searching hers, checking for any sign of fear. And she, in turn, let go. She let the fear dissolve. She was not a ruined thing. She was not a piece of damaged property. She was Clara, and he was Wade, and in this small, rough cabin, they were healing each other. When it was over, she cried. She wept against his damp shoulder, quiet, healing tears. He did not pull away. He did not roll over and sleep. He held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his breath stirring her hair. He treated her not as an act completed, but as a person found, days afterward. The change in Clara was visible. She smiled. It was a small thing, a slight upturn of her lips when she gathered the eggs, a genuine warmth when Wade returned from the range. The heavy, protective armor she had worn since her arrival had begun to fall away. They rode into Eden Ridge for supplies 2 weeks later. The town was the same, muddy, windblown, judgmental. The whispers still followed her as she stepped onto the boardwalk of the general store. There she is, the Boston runaway. But Clara was different. She held her head high, not with the rigid, defensive pride of her arrival, but with a new, quiet confidence. She met their stares. Sarah Dalton, whose husband ran cattle on the next spread, was in the store, arguing with the proprietor, Mr. Hatcher, over the price of flour. She was a tall, raw-boned woman with kind eyes and a mouth set in a permanent line of practicality. "It's thievery, Hatcher, and you know it," she was saying. "Freight costs, Mrs. Dalton, freight costs." Hatcher droned. Clara, needing flour herself, stood nearby, waiting. Sarah Dalton turned, saw her, and her eyes flicked to Wade, who was loading sacks of feed at the back. She gave Clara a short, assessing nod. "Mrs. Mercer," Sarah said. It was not entirely welcoming. "Mrs. Dalton," Clara replied. She saw Sarah's young son, perhaps 5 years old, drop a small glass jar of horehound candy. It shattered on the floorboards. The boy's face crumpled, bracing for a scolding. Before Sarah could react, Clara knelt. "Oh, hush now. It's all right," she said softly. She began picking up the larger pieces of glass, her movements careful. "It's just candy. We can get more." She smiled at the boy, and her smile was real. Sarah Dalton watched her, her expression softening. She had heard the rumors of a high-strung, ruined aristocrat. This woman, kneeling in the dirt to comfort a child, was not that. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice different now. "He's a terror for that candy." "I was rather a terror for it myself," Clara admitted, standing and brushing the dust from her skirt. A small friendship was earned. It was not much. The rumors still hung in the air like smoke. But for the first time, Clara felt she was not just in this place, but perhaps, one day, she could be of it. The mail had arrived on the same stage. Mr. Hatcher sorted through the small pile. "Mercer," he called out. "One for you, one for the missus." Wade came forward. He took a bill from the livery. The other was for her. Clara took it. Her blood turned to ice. It was not her family script. It was not her mother's shaky hand. It was fine, heavy linen paper, the kind that cost 10 cents a sheet. It was addressed in a sharp, elegant, forward-slanting hand she knew as well as her own. Mrs. Wade Mercer, Eden Ridge, Wyoming Territory. She must have made a sound, because Wade's hand was on her arm. "Clara, what is it?" She could not answer. She was back in the gas-lit parlor, the smell of cigar smoke and whiskey in the air. She was staring at the man her father had chosen for her. "It's from him," she whispered. She did not open it on the ride home. She clutched it in her gloved hand, the sharp corners digging into her palm. The day, which had been bright, felt dark. Back in the cabin, she sat at the table. Wade stood by the door, watching her. He did not crowd her. He just waited. Her hands shook so badly she tore the envelope. She unfolded the single sheet. "My dearest Clara, did you truly believe you could hide from me in that savage wasteland? Did you think I would simply allow my property to be stolen by some illiterate farmer? I was disappointed. Your father's solution was pathetic, shipping you off like damaged goods. But then, you always were a damaged, difficult thing. I have concluded my business in Boston. My father's partners are quite satisfied. And now, I find I have the time for a trip west. I have always wanted to see the mountains. And I am, of course, eager to retrieve what is mine. I look forward to meeting your husband. I am sure he will be reasonable, once a proper sum is discussed. Do not bother running. You know I always find you. Yours, Nathaniel Keats. Clara began to shake. It was a violent, bone-deep tremor. This was not the broken weeping of her arrival. This was terror. Clara. Wade crossed the room in 2 strides. He took the letter from her unresisting fingers. He read it. His face, already weathered, seemed to harden, as if the wind had carved new lines into it. "He's coming," Clara choked out. "Wade, you don't understand. He's not just a man. He's a monster." "Tell me," Wade said. His voice was flat. "I told you about the affair," she said, the words tumbling out. "But I didn't tell you the truth. I didn't want him. Not really. He was my tutor. He was charming. But Nathaniel Keats—" She stopped, trying to breathe. "He was my father's choice for me. Before the tutor, he courted me." She stood up, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. "He was cruel. He was possessive. He would whisper things he would do to me after we were married. He liked to hurt things. Small animals. He told me it made them more beautiful, to see them afraid." Wade's expression did not change, but his eyes grew cold, the gray turning to slate. "I was terrified of him. The tutor, he was an escape. He was gentle. And Nathaniel found out. He was the one who told my father. He did it for revenge, to see me shamed, to see me destroyed." She was sobbing now, pulling at her hair. "But I didn't tell you the worst of it. The manipulation, the threats. He would corner me, in the library, in the music room. He would smile, and he would grip my arm. Here." She touched her upper arm. A phantom pain. "He would grip it so hard, his fingers like steel, and he would smile at my mother across the room and say, 'Your daughter is a vision, Mrs. Whitmore.'" She looked at Wade, desperate for him to understand. "He left bruises hidden under my silk dresses. He told me if I ever told anyone, he would ruin my father's reputation. He said he would hire men to beat the tutor to death. He said he would buy my silence with my family's honor. And he would have. He has money. Wade. So much money." She collapsed onto the stool, her face in her hands. "He's coming here to kill you. He will. He'll buy the sheriff. He'll hire guns. And he will kill you and drag me back. We have to run." Wade Mercer stood utterly still. The man who had been all quiet patience and gentle hands was gone. In his place was something cold and dangerous. His demeanor changed. He was quiet. He was still, but a terrible, contained rage simmered in his jawline. His hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists, the knuckles white. The scar on his face seemed to pulsate. He looked at the letter, then at her. He bent down and tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. "He is not touching you," Wade said. The words were not a comfort. They were a vow. "He is not setting foot on this land." He turned from her. "You are not facing him. I am—" "No!" she screamed. "You can't. He will kill you." "I promise you, Clara," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "He won't." A week passed. The spring warmth felt like a lie. The valley, which had begun to feel like a home, now felt like a trap. Wade changed. He was still kind to her, his touch still gentle in the night. But during the day, he was a different man. He was a guardian. He spent hours on the high ridge to the east, the one that overlooked the trail from Eden Ridge. He would sit there with his rifle across his knees, just watching. He cleaned his rifle every night, and the pistol he kept in his trunk. He strapped the pistol to his hip in the morning and did not take it off until he came to bed. The rifle was no longer over the door. It leaned against the wall by the table, always within reach. One afternoon, he rode back to the cabin at a hard gallop, a thing she had never seen him do. He swung down from the roan before it had even stopped. He came inside, his face grim. "They're here," he said. "3 riders. Came into town an hour ago. One of them." He paused. "He's wearing Boston clothes, a duster, but city boots, and a city hat." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. "Nathaniel, they're at the saloon, asking questions. Silas rode out to warn me. He said they're asking about the Boston lady who married a local." That night, the tension was unbearable. Clara could not eat. She could not sit still. The cabin was a cage. Every hoot of an owl, every snap of a twig, was him. "Wade," she said, her voice shaking. She grabbed the front of his shirt. "Please, I am begging you, let's go, now. We can take the horses. We can ride north, to Oregon, to anywhere. Please, Wade." He was checking the loads in his pistol. He worked with a calm, deadly focus. "He has money. Wade, he will have hired guns. That's the other 2 men. You are 1 man. You can't fight them. They will kill you, and it will be my fault." He finished loading the last chamber and snapped the pistol shut. He set it carefully on the table. He turned and put his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding her. He made her look at him. His gray eyes were steady, clear, and absolutely cold. "Clara," he said, "you're done running." He pulled her closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're mine now." He said it not as a brand of ownership, not as the possessive claim Nathaniel had made. He said it as a statement of fact, a declaration of loyalty. It was a promise. That means something. Nathaniel Keats did not arrive in Eden Ridge like a man entering the wilderness. He arrived like a man taking possession of it. He stepped from the morning stagecoach not onto the muddy street, but onto the boardwalk, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He wore a fine wool duster, but beneath it, Clara would have recognized the tailored suit of a Boston banker. He was flanked by 2 men, hard cases who looked as if they had been carved from the unforgiving land. One was a gaunt man with dead eyes named Lantry. The other, a heavy, bearded brute named Cole. Nathaniel did not go to the general store. He went to the one place in town that held authority, the saloon, which doubled as the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man who lived on a diet of stale whiskey and simmering resentment. He was a small man given a tin star, and he despised anyone who did not acknowledge its shine. He particularly despised Wade Mercer. Mercer was quiet, self-sufficient, and had never once shown Brody the deference the sheriff felt he was owed. Wade Mercer looked at him, and Brody knew, with a sick certainty, that the man saw straight through him. Nathaniel Keats walked in, Lantry and Cole fanning out behind him. The saloon went quiet. Nathaniel removed his fine leather gloves, placing them on the bar. "Information," Nathaniel said to the room, his voice carrying the crisp, educated accent of the East. "I am searching for a lady, a Miss Clara Whitmore, or perhaps she is using another name. She is unwell." He tapped his temple, a look of profound, theatrical sadness on his handsome face. "She suffers from hysteria, delusions, a tragic affliction. She fell under the influence of a rather rough character and fled her family, who adores her. I have tracked her here." Brody, sitting at his desk in the corner, narrowed his eyes. He knew exactly who the man meant. The Boston runaway, Mercer's mail-order wife. "She's here," Brody said, leaning his chair back. "But she ain't Miss Whitmore. She's Mrs. Mercer, married Wade Mercer nigh on 2 months back." Nathaniel smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Ah, then he is the one, the man who abducted her, taking advantage of her fragile state. I am her fiancé, gentlemen. I am here to return her to her doctors." Lantry, the gaunt one, slid a heavy gold coin across the bar. "The boss is asking for the law's help in retrieving his property." Brody looked at the coin. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the 2 hard cases. He thought of Wade Mercer, who had never bought him a drink, who had never asked him for a thing. "Mercer's place is 2 hours out," Brody said, his voice greasy. Nathaniel approached the sheriff's desk. He sat opposite Brody, leaning in as if sharing a confidence. "Sheriff, I understand the complexities of frontier law. A man like Mercer, He is likely dangerous. He has taken advantage of a sick, wealthy woman. Her family will be profoundly grateful for her safe return. He slid a small, heavy leather pouch onto the desk. It landed with a soft, heavy clink. "Perhaps $200 in gratitude," Nathaniel murmured. Brody's hand closed over the pouch. He hated Wade Mercer's quiet pride. He hated the way Mercer looked at him. This was justice. This was respect. "He abducted her," Brody said, his voice firming. "Taking advantage of her madness. That's a territorial crime. We'll ride out at first light." Wade knew they were coming before they were halfway from town. Silas, his young ranch hand, had been watching the saloon. He had seen the money pass, seen the men drinking with the sheriff. He had slipped out the back, saddled his horse, and rode like the devil. He burst into the cabin, his face pale. "Wade, they're coming. The sheriff, and 3 others. That fancy man from Boston. Brody's calling it an abduction. He's deputized the 2 hard cases." Clara's blood ran cold. She dropped the tin plate she was washing. Wade did not panic. He did not curse. He became absolutely still. He looked at Clara, and his eyes were flat and hard as slate. "Go," he said. "Wade, no, we fight. You heard me. Go. Pack your journal, your coat, the blankets. Take the jerky from the smokehouse and the coffee. Now. Clara." He was already loading his rifle. He grabbed a canvas sack, stuffing it with cartridges, a skinning knife, and a length of rope. "Silas," Wade said, "ride back to town. Be seen, go to the saloon. You tell them you haven't seen me. You tell them I was heading north, to the Wind River Range, looking for strays. You buy me time. You understand?" Silas nodded, his eyes wide. "I understand. Godspeed. Wade." He was gone. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her hands shaking as she shoved the hardtack and jerky into a saddlebag. "Up," Wade said. He slung the bag over one shoulder, his rifle in his hand. "Into the ridges. There's an old trapper's cabin. Used to be my father's line camp. No one's been there in 10 years. They did not take the horses. The horses left tracks. They would climb. They left the cabin, Wade leading the way, moving at a steady, ground-eating pace. He led her up the steep incline behind the homestead, into the dark pine and the jagged rock. It was a brutal climb. Clara's lungs burning, her city boots slipping on the scree. Wade never slowed, but his hand was always there, grabbing her arm, pulling her up impossible stretches of rock. They reached it just as the sky turned a bruised purple. It was barely a cabin. It was a hole dug into the side of a ridge, walled with rotting logs and chinked with ancient mud. The roof was sod, overgrown with weeds, but it was hidden, and it was high. Wade pushed the rotted door open. The inside smelled of dust, old fur, and cold stone. There was a rusted stove, a collapsed bunk, and nothing else. "Stay here," he said. He was gone for an hour. He returned with the placid mare he had bought for her, the one from the barn. He had taken the long way, circling to retrieve her. "If we have to run, we run fast. 1 horse, 2 riders." He picketed the mare in a dense thicket of aspen 50 yards down the slope, where she would be invisible. Then he returned. He blocked the cabin door not with the rotted wood, but with a large flat stone he rolled into place from the inside. They were sealed in. And then the snow began. It was not the gentle snow of a Boston Christmas. It was a silent, early, high-country blizzard. It fell not in flakes, but in a thick, suffocating sheet. It erased the world. It erased their tracks. It erased the town of Eden Ridge. They were trapped. For 3 days. They lived in the dark. They did not dare light a fire in the stove. The smoke would be a beacon. They sat in the freezing, near total blackness, the only light a thin crack in the stone door. The wind howled over the ridge, a high, lonely sound. They lived on coffee, cold, and hardtack. The jerky was so tough Clara could barely chew it, her jaw aching. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that tried to crawl inside her. On the second night, she was shaking so hard she thought she would break. She was wrapped in her coat and a blanket, but it wasn't enough. "Come here." Wade's voice came from the darkness. She crawled to him. He was huddled against the far wall, wrapped in a collection of old, stiff fur blankets he had found in the ruined bunk. They smelled like dust and animal. He pulled her against him, wrapping the heavy furs around them both. He did not just hold her, he enveloped her. She pressed her face against his chest, her small frame tucked against his solid warmth. His arms were tight around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They grew closer in that isolation. The world was reduced to the sound of each other's breathing and the hiss of the snow outside. They spoke in whispers. "This is my fault," she whispered into his shirt. "I brought this. I've trapped you." "Hush," he said, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "We ain't trapped. We're waiting. He will find us. Let him try. This is my land. He's a tourist." She traced the scar on his jaw, a line she could feel but not see. "You never talk about your ghosts. Wade." He was silent for a long time. She felt him breathe. "Some ghosts, they're quieter than others." She grew bolder in the dark. Her fear of him long since evaporated, replaced by a slow, aching desire that was amplified by the cold and the danger. She pressed a small kiss to his throat. He tensed. "Clara, don't!" "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We are here. We might die here." "We ain't dying here," he said, his voice rough. He pulled her tighter. I ain't him. I ain't Nathaniel. I won't take you in fear, not in a hole in the ground." But his resolve was cracking. She felt it. His hand moved from her back, his fingers tangling in her hair. He tilted her head back. He kissed her. And his kiss was not the slow reverence of their first night. It was desperate. It was hungry. It was the kiss of a man who had been alone for a decade, who had found something he never thought he would have, and who was now facing losing it. "You're my home, Clara." He whispered against her lips, his voice raw. "Only one I got." He held her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "When this is done, not before." On the fourth morning, the snow stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. "I'm going out," Wade said, "to check the pass. Stay here. Do not move the stone." He slipped out, moving like a shadow. Clara was left alone in the cold dark. It was the longest hour of her life. He returned, his face a mask of cold fury. "He's here," Wade said, rolling the stone back. "How? The snow!" "He found the mare." Clara's heart stopped. I thought you hit her." "I did, but he didn't track me. He tracked her. He stole her from the barn, before we left." Clara remembered. Nathaniel liked to hurt things. He had taken the horse not to ride, but as a lure. He had known Wade would have to check on his stock, or that the horse, left alone, would return to the main cabin. "He found her," Wade said, his voice flat. "He tracked her up here. He's got Brody and the two gunmen. They're on the switchback, below the pass. They're waiting. They know we're up here. They're just waiting for us to starve or freeze. What do? We don't," Wade said. He checked his rifle. He checked his pistol. "I do. They're blocking the pass. That's the only way down. They think they have me pinned." "But they do." "They're blocking the easy way." He slung the saddlebag with the remaining ammunition over his shoulder. "They're fools. They're sitting in the open, waiting for me to come to them. I'm going to come from above." He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a terrible resolve. "Barricade this door. Do not open it, not for any reason. You fire this, if the stone moves." He pressed his pistol into her hands. "Wade, no!" "You're done running," he said. "That means something." He kissed her, hard and fast, and then he was gone, slipping out the door and into the blinding white snow. Clara was alone, the heavy pistol cold in her hands. The first shot echoed through the high, thin air, a sharp crack that bounced off the canyon walls. Clara screamed. She scrambled to the crack in the door, trying to see. Nothing, just white. Another shot. Then 2 more. Fast. A yell, cut short. She couldn't stay. She couldn't hide. He was out there. She pushed the stone. It was heavy, but her panic gave her strength. She rolled it just enough to slip out. She crawled onto the ledge, her eyes smarting from the snow's glare. The world was white and silent. Below her, on the narrow cliffside pass, she saw them. Wade was pinned behind a triangle of rock. Below him, the 2 gunmen, Lantry and Cole, were advancing, using the switchbacks for cover. Sheriff Brody was further back, by the horses, holding a rifle he clearly did not want to use, and Nathaniel, he was standing on a high rock, out of the line of fire, watching. He was smiling. "Give her up, Mercer!" Nathaniel's voice was clear and civilized in the cold air. "You are one man, a savage. Give me my fiancée, and I will let you bleed out in peace." Wade fired. The shot kicked up snow inches from Lantry's foot. Cole advanced. "He's just one man, boss." Wade knew he was trapped. He had to move. He had to get a better angle. He waited for Lantry to fire, then bolted from his cover, heading for a higher cluster of rocks. He was too slow. The snow was deep. Lantry fired. The bullet hit Wade in the left shoulder. Clara saw it. She saw him spin, a dark stain blossoming on his jacket. He grunted, falling to one knee. His rifle clattered from his grasp, sliding down the icy rock to land on a ledge 10 feet below him. "Wade!" she screamed. He clutched his shoulder, trying to reach for the pistol at his hip, but his left arm was useless. Cole saw his chance. He stood up, laughing, taking careful aim at the wounded man. "Got him!" Nathaniel watched, his smile widening. Clara moved. She was not a fighter. She was not a frontier woman. She was a lady from Boston who played the piano, but she was not the woman who had arrived in Eden Ridge. She saw Wade's rifle on the ledge. It was below her, above him. She slid down the snow-covered embankment, her hands raw, her skirts tearing. She landed on the ledge, her boots skidding on the ice. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined. Cole was lining up his shot. Clara, shaking so violently she could barely stand, lifted the rifle. She did not know how to aim. She did not know how to brace. She just pointed the heavy barrel in the direction of the man who was about to kill her husband. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her own shoulder, sending her sprawling backward onto the ice. But the shot was true. Cole stood still for a second. He looked down at his chest, a dark, spreading stain. He looked up at Clara, his face a mask of pure surprise. Then he toppled backward, disappearing over the side of the cliff. The silence was absolute. Lantry, the other gunman, stared at his dead partner. He stared at Wade, who was now on his feet, his pistol in his right hand. He stared at the woman, wild-eyed and fierce, scrambling back up the rocks. Nathaniel's smile was gone. His face was pale, ugly with rage. "Kill them! Kill them both!" Lantry looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the sheer drop. He looked at the blood on Wade's jacket and the pistol in his hand. He was not being paid enough for this. "Go to hell," Lantry spat. He grabbed the reins of Nathaniel's fine horse, swung onto his own, and dug his heels in, galloping back down the pass, dragging the second horse with him. Sheriff Brody, seeing his support vanish, had already turned and fled. It was just Nathaniel. He stood on his rock, unarmed, his fine duster flapping in the wind. He looked at Wade, who was now leveling his pistol. He looked at Clara, who was standing beside Wade, her hands bloody. Nathaniel Keats, for the first time in his life, was afraid. He turned and ran, scrambling down the rocks, chasing after his hired man. The adrenaline vanished. Clara turned to Wade. "You're hit. It's just the shoulder," he grunted, but his face was white. "We have to go back." He took 2 steps toward the cabin. Then his knees buckled. The snow around his boots was red. He collapsed. Wade, stay with me." He was conscious, but the blood loss was too fast. "Clara, run." "No, I am done running." She grabbed him under his good arm. He was a dead weight. She was not strong enough. "Get up," She screamed at him, her voice cracking. "Get up! Wade!" He tried. He pushed with his legs. She pulled. She dragged him. She fell and pulled him over her. She got up and dragged him again. It was a yard, then another. She tore her hands on the icy rocks. Her lungs burned. It was not a walk. It was a brutal, agonizing battle against his weight and the snow. It took her, she thought, an hour. She hauled him the last few feet, rolling him into the trapper's cabin. He was unconscious. She rolled the stone back into place. She was shaking, but she was fierce. She tore his jacket and shirt away. The wound was ugly. A dark hole in his shoulder, bleeding heavily. She had to stop it. She had her sewing kit. She took the small needle and the linen thread. She poured the last of their coffee into the tin pot, heated it with the few matches they had, and boiled the needle. She tore her own chemise into strips for bandages. She pressed a piece of leather from his boot into his hand. "Bite this." He was delirious, but his hand closed on it. She stitched the wound. Her hands, which had trembled holding the rifle, were now steady. She pulled the thread tight, her stomach turning at the sight. But she did it. She stitched her husband back together. She bandaged him, packed the wound with snow to slow the swelling, and covered him with every fur. He burned. The wound was dirty. The fever set in that night, and it was violent. He thrashed, his good arm lashing out. He was not in the cabin. He was somewhere else. "Jesse!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Jesse, no, put the gun down. She ain't worth it. They'll hang you." Clara knelt beside him, wiping his face with snow. "Shh, Wade, it's me. It's Clara." Left him. He moaned, his eyes rolling. "They said I should have stopped him. They blamed me, the whole town." Clara listened, her heart breaking. She pieced it together through the fevered shouts. His brother, Jesse, hot-headed, younger. He had tried to protect a woman in a saloon, a drunk gang. Jesse had pulled his gun. Someone had ended up dead. "I didn't stop him," Wade whispered, his body rigid. "I ran. I had to run. They put him in the ground. And I ran." He had been banished, too. He had been blamed. He knew, better than anyone, what it was to carry a ghost. On the second morning, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear but hollow with pain and memory. He looked at her, and the shame in his eyes was deeper than the physical pain. He remembered what he had said. Clara leaned down, her hair falling around his face. She pressed her lips to his hot temple. "Shh," she whispered. "I know." He tried to turn his face away. "I left him. We carry our ghosts," she said, her voice soft but strong, her hand stroking his hair. "They ride with us. But we're still breathing, Wade. We're still breathing, still loving." Wade survived. He survived because Clara refused to let him die. For 2 days in that cold, dark hole, she was his anchor. She kept the wound clean with boiled snow. She spooned the last of their coffee, thinned with water, into his mouth. She held him, her own small body a bulwark against the fever, whispering to him, pulling him back from the delirious shadows of his past. His confession hung in the air between them, not as a point of shame, but as a bridge. She knew his ghosts now, and he knew hers. They were, in truth, finally and completely equals. On the third morning, he was weak, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear. He was alive. The journey back down the ridge was a slow, agonizing trial. Wade, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a sling she had fashioned from a blanket, leaned heavily on her. They used the mare, Wade sagging in the saddle, Clara walking beside him, her hand on his leg to steady him, her other hand gripping the mare's bridle. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder. He never complained. When they emerged from the foothills, the snow had already melted from the valley floor, leaving the world a damp, clean-swept brown. They saw the homestead first. It was untouched. The barn was quiet. Their few cows were grazing by the creek, and the chickens were scratching in the yard. They walked toward Eden Ridge. They needed supplies. They needed a doctor. Their arrival silenced the town. It was just past noon. Men paused on the boardwalk. Sarah Dalton, the rancher's wife Clara had met, stopped in the middle of the street, her hand flying to her mouth. They were a ruin. Wade was slumped over the horse, his jacket stiff with dried blood. Clara was walking beside him, her dress torn to rags, her hair a wild, matted tangle. Her face and hands were streaked with soot, mud, and his blood. They were bloodied, exhausted, but they were not broken. They were together. The whispers that had haunted Clara since her arrival were gone. No one looked at her as the Boston runaway. No one saw a sullied woman. Mr. Hatcher, the storekeep, was the first to move. He ran out of his store. "Mr. Mercer, God Almighty, what happened?" Silas, the young ranch hand, burst from the saloon. "Wade, I thought they said—" "He needs a doctor," Clara said, her voice a raw croak, but it was a voice of command. The townsfolk, who had once stared in judgment, now stared in awe. Lantry, the hired gun who had fled, had passed back through. He had gotten drunk in the saloon, waiting for the stage, and he had talked. He had told everyone about the bribe, about Sheriff Brody's cowardice. He had told them about his partner, Cole, being shot off a cliff, and he had told them, with a mix of disbelief and fear, that it was the woman who had done it. They saw Clara Whitmore Mercer, the delicate Eastern lady, and they saw the woman who had survived a blizzard in a hole, killed a man to protect her husband, and dragged that husband back from the dead. The rumors were replaced by a stunned, profound respect. "Get him to the pastor's house," Sarah Dalton ordered, taking charge. "It's the cleanest. Silas, fetch Doc Miller from South Pass. Ride hard. Mr. Hatcher, get whiskey and bandages, clean ones." They helped Wade from the horse, his face gray with the effort. He kept his feet, but only just, his good arm wrapped around Hatcher's shoulder. Clara did not let go of him, her small hand gripping his belt. The story of Sheriff Brody was already a town legend. He had returned to town alone, babbling about an ambush, claiming Mercer had gone mad. But Lantry's story had painted him a coward and a criminal when confronted by the town's elders. Brody had tried to bluster. Then he had tried to plead. It was no use. His authority, built on fear and whiskey, dissolved. He had turned in his tin star, taken his bottle, and disappeared on the morning stage. A disgraced, broken man. Eden Ridge was without a lawman. 2 days later, as Wade lay healing in the pastor's clean bed, the town council met in the saloon. They needed a new sheriff, someone who wouldn't fold, someone who couldn't be bought. They elected Elias Thorne. He was an older man, a rancher from the High Valley who had lost his family to fever years before. He was quiet, like Wade, but his eyes were kind, and his hands were steady. He was a man of proven principle. Elias Thorne's first official act was to ride out to the Mercer homestead. He found Wade sitting on his porch, his arm in a clean sling. Clara was nearby, splitting kindling, her movements now sure and practiced. Thorne dismounted, his hat in his hand. "Mercer, ma'am." "Sheriff." Wade greeted him, nodding. "The town." "We're grateful," Thorne said, fumbling with his hat brim. "And we're ashamed of what Brody did. It wasn't right. Brody is gone." Wade said. It was all that needed to be said. "That he is—" Thorne cleared his throat. "Which is why I'm here. I've got a badge. This one." He tapped his own. "And I've got a spare. I'm an old man. Wade, I need a deputy. I need a man the town trusts. A man who knows how to handle trouble." He held out the small, shining tin star. Wade looked at the badge. He looked at the mountains, his land. He looked at Clara, who had paused, watching him. He thought of his brother, Jesse, and the violence that had driven him from his first home. "I appreciate the trust, Sheriff, more than you know," Wade said, his voice quiet. "But I'm a rancher, not a lawman. I've got my own fences to mend." Thorne nodded, not surprised. "I understand. But the offer stands if you ever change your mind. He put the badge back in his pocket. The trust is yours, regardless. Wade nodded, and the two men shared a look of mutual respect. News of Nathaniel Keats came a week later. The stage driver brought the word Lantry, the surviving gunman, had made it to South Pass City. He had gotten drunk and bragged about the whole affair. The $200 bribe, the murder of his partner Cole, and the demon woman who had shot him. But Lantry had made a mistake. The marshal in South Pass City was not a man like Brody. He was a federal marshal, and he took a dim view of bribery and murder. He had arrested Lantry. Nathaniel Keats, trying to buy a private coach east, had been arrested right alongside him. He was being held for the traveling circuit judge. The judge, a man named Miller, was a hard, sharp-eyed man who had seen too much of the frontier to be fooled by a fine suit. His court was the saloon in Eden Ridge, cleared of its tables, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and unvarnished justice. Nathaniel was there. He sat in a chair, guarded by Marshal Thorne, his fine suit rumpled, his face a mask of pale, aristocratic rage. He had a lawyer from Cheyenne, a slick man who smelled of pomade. "We are here," Judge Miller said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "to hear the case against Mr. Nathaniel Keats on the charges of conspiracy, bribery of a public official, and attempted murder." The Cheyenne lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is a grotesque misunderstanding. My client, a gentleman of standing, was merely attempting to retrieve his fiancée, a woman known to suffer from hysteria, who was abducted by the man, Wade Mercer." "Is that so?" the judge drawled. "Then let's hear from the hysterical woman. Call Clara Mercer." Clara stood from the back of the room. Wade was beside her, his good hand on the small of her back. He could not go with her. She had to do this alone. She walked the length of the saloon. Every eye was on her. She was not the wild-eyed creature from the mountain. She was dressed in her best, simple gray dress, her hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She held her chin high. She took the stand. Nathaniel stared at her, his eyes full of a cold, possessive hatred. "Mrs. Mercer," the judge said, "tell me what happened." Clara looked not at the lawyer, not at Nathaniel, but at the judge, and she spoke. Her voice was clear. It did not tremble. She told them everything. She told them about the courtship in Boston, the emotional manipulation, the threats. She told them about the bruises hidden under her silk dresses. "He told me," she said, her voice ringing in the silent room, "that if I did not do as he wished, he would ruin my father. He told me he liked to see me afraid." The lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection! This is slander. The woman is clearly unstable. She is maligning a man of good character. She is telling her story. Counselor." Judge Miller snapped, "Sit down." Clara continued. She told them about the letter. She told them about him arriving in town, and the bribe she knew he had paid. She told them about fleeing to the ridges, and she told them about the pass. "He called for my husband to be murdered," she said, her gaze finally shifting to Nathaniel. He flinched. "He ordered his men to kill Wade Mercer, so he could retrieve what was his. He does not see me as a person. He sees me as property. He is a cruel, empty man, and he would have left my husband to die in the snow." The lawyer tried. He cross-examined her. He called her a liar. He called her an adulteress. He painted her as a madwoman. Through it all, Clara remained calm. She met his accusations with the cold, hard truth. When he was finished, she was still sitting tall. The room was silent. Judge Miller looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Keats, your fiancée seems quite lucid to me. In fact, she seems more credible than your high-priced lawyer." He slammed his gavel. "Given the testimony of the gunman Lantry, who has turned witness for a lesser sentence, and the clear testimony of Mrs. Mercer, this court finds you guilty. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of bribery, guilty of assault." Nathaniel's face turned white. "This is not Boston, Mr. Keats," the judge said. his voice like ice. "We do not value a man by the cut of his suit. We value him by his actions, and your actions are despicable." "You can't," Nathaniel shrieked, his fine manners shattering. He lunged to his feet. "I am Nathaniel Keats. My father—" "Your father is not here," Judge Miller said, "and you will be going to the territorial prison at Laramie. I sentence you to 20 years of hard labor. Marshal, remove him!" Nathaniel screamed, a high, thin sound of pure rage, as Thorne hauled him from the chair and dragged him from the room. It was over. Clara stood, her legs trembling. She walked out of the saloon, out of the darkness and the smell of whiskey, and into the bright, clean sunlight. She was free. The thought was so large, it had no place to land. She had faced her monster. She had spoken her truth, and she had won. The weight of her entire life, the shame, the banishment, the fear, the fight, all of it crashed down on her at once. Her knees buckled. A sob, not of sadness, but of pure, absolute release, tore from her throat. She did not fall. Wade was there. He had been waiting by the door. He caught her as she stumbled, his one good arm coming around her, pulling her tight against his solid chest. She buried her face in his shirt, her body shaking apart. He held her, his hand stroking her hair. He let her cry, his chin resting on her head. He whispered into her hair, "You're free now, truly free." They rode home. The valley, their land, seemed new, the colors sharper. The air felt easier to breathe. That night, they sat by the fire. Wade was on his stool, his arm resting, watching her. Clara felt a restless energy. There was one last thing. She went to her trunk and took out the small, oilcloth-wrapped packet of letters from her family. She opened the last one, the one from her father, the one that had banished her. She read the cold, unforgiving words one last time. "You are no longer a daughter of this house. Do not write. Do not return. You have made your bed in disgrace." She looked at Wade, who watched her, his gray eyes full of understanding. He knew what this was. Clara walked to the hearth. She held the letter over the flames, and she let it go. She watched the edges curl, the ink blacken and disappear. She watched her old life, her old shame, turn to white ash and float up the chimney. She was no longer Clara Whitmore of Boston. She was Clara Mercer of Wyoming. She turned back to the table. Wade had stopped his whittling. He was pushing something across the rough plank wood toward her. It was a small, crudely carved wooden box. She picked it up. It was warm from his hands. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He just nodded, his face unreadable. But his eyes were wide with a raw, vulnerable hope. She opened the box. Inside, resting on a small piece of dark velvet, was a ring. It was not gold, it was not silver, it was wood, a simple, dark band he had carved himself from the heart of an aspen. It was not perfectly round, it was rough in places, but it was heartfelt. It was, she realized, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Tears, not of grief, but of a joy so profound it hurt, welled in her eyes. She looked at him, and he was watching her, terrified of her answer. "Yes," she whispered, the tears spilling over. "Yes." She said it before he could even ask the question. She took the ring and slid it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly. Later, in the darkness of their cabin, in the bed they now shared, there were no more barriers. The ghosts had been faced. The past had been burned. He kissed her, and it was not the hesitant kiss of their first encounter, nor the desperate kiss of the trapper's cabin. It was a kiss of certainty. It was a promise. Their love-making was not the slow, reverent exploration of their first time. It was unrestrained. It was fierce. It was the unrestrained, joyful claiming of two whole people, forged in fire. Finally, truly, coming home. It was a night of pure, unadulterated healing. Afterward, they lay tangled, the cool night air coming through the open window, the sound of the creek a soft murmur. He held her, his hand tracing the line of her spine, a line he now knew by heart. He kissed her temple, his lips moving against her skin. "You're not broken," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he would never be able to name. You never were. The months bled one into the next, and the high, lonely country became, simply, home. Summer arrived in a wave of dry heat, baking the mud of spring into a cracked, pale dust. The valley turned from brown to a muted, silvery green, the grasses growing tall and heavy. Clara, who had arrived as a fragile, breakable thing, was forged anew by the land. Her hands, once soft from piano keys, were now hard, calloused, and capable. She wore the small wooden ring Wade had carved her, and it felt more real, more binding, than any diamond from Boston ever could. She was no longer just a wife. She was part of the ranch. When one of their cows, a young heifer, went into a difficult labor, Wade had been on the North Range. Clara found the animal thrashing in the creek bed. She did not panic. She did not ride for help. She simply tied back her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and did what was necessary. She remembered what Wade had taught her, his voice low and patient. Animals sense fear. You be the calm, you be the anchor. She stayed with the heifer for 3 hours, her arms slick with fluid, her voice a low, steady murmur. When Wade returned at dusk, he found Clara, exhausted and mud-streaked, guiding a wet, wobbly calf to its mother. He just stood and watched, and the look in his eyes, a mixture of awe and a pride so deep it was painful, was all the thanks she needed. She learned to ride not like a lady, side saddle and delicate, but like a rancher. She rode astride, her divided skirt practical, her seat firm. She learned to move with the horse, to read the terrain. Soon, she was riding the fence lines with Wade, her skill surprising even Silas, who had long since stopped smirking and now treated her with a gruff, brotherly respect. When the fall harvest came, the Valley families gathered at the Thorn Ranch for a communal meal. It was Sarah Dalton, the woman who had first offered Clara a tentative friendship, who asked her to organize the meal. The whispers about the Boston runaway were a distant memory, replaced by the legend of the woman who had faced down Nathaniel Keats and shot a man off a cliff. Clara, who had once presided over silent, suffocating Boston dinners, now moved with purpose among the rough-hewn tables, laughing with the women, directing the placement of the pies, her face flushed with heat and belonging. Wade, in these months, found a peace that had eluded him his entire life. His natural quietness deepened, but it was no longer the silence of solitude. It was the silence of contentment. He spoke less, but he watched more. His eyes, when they rested on Clara, seemed to shine, a private warmth that was reserved only for her. He had lived his life as a man braced against the world. Now, he was a man at rest. Their evenings became a ritual. The world outside the cabin windows would fade to indigo, the coyotes calling from the ridges. The lamp would be lit, the fire banked. Clara would pull out one of her books, the one she had carried like a lifeline from her old life. "This one," she said one night, tracing the letter on the page. "This is A." Wade sat beside her at the table, his large, scarred hand clumsy as he tried to copy the letter onto a piece of slate. He had never learned. His mother had known, but his father had seen reading as a weakness. After his parents died, there was only survival. "It looks like a mountain," he murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It does," she smiled. "And this is B, for book." She was patient. She was the teacher, and he the student. She, who had been taught by a man who used words as weapons, now used them as gifts. She taught him how to string letters into his own name, into Clara, into home. In return, he taught her the land. He took her to the high ridge and showed her how to read the clouds. "When they're thin and pulled, like horsetails," he'd say, his voice low. "That's wind. High wind. When they're heavy on the peaks, that's snow, even in summer." He taught her the names of the stars, the constellations his father had taught him. He showed her the difference between the track of a deer and the track of an antelope. He was giving her his language, the language of the earth, just as she was giving him hers, They were building a world between them, one made of letters and of hawks, of poetry and of pine smoke. The peace was real, but the land, Clara learned, was never truly tamed. The wildfire struck in late August, at the height of the dry season. It started with a smell. Clara was kneading bread, the morning sun streaming through the clean window. She paused, sniffing, smoke, but there was no fire in the stove. She stepped outside. The sky to the west, over the high peaks, was not blue. It was a sick, yellowish gray, and a plume of dark smoke, massive and terrifying, was building, climbing miles into the air. Wade was already riding in from the pasture, his horse at a dead run. "It's bad," he yelled, swinging down. "Dry lightning strike on the peak. The wind is pushing it this way. Fast." The valley, which had been a place of quiet ranches, became a frantic ant hill. The sky turned a dark, apocalyptic red. The sun was a dull, copper coin, barely visible through the haze. Ash began to fall. Soft, gray flakes that coated everything, tasting bitter on the tongue. "Silas is with the cattle, driving them to the river," Wade said, his face grim, already strapping his pistol on. "I'm riding for the Thorn Ranch. The fire is coming down his canyon first. You go to the Daltons. Sarah will need help with her stock. Take the mare, ride hard, and do not stop." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her hands fisted at her sides. "This ain't Nathaniel, Clara. This is fire. It don't reason. It just eats. Now, go. I'll meet you there." He kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of smoke and fear. And then he was gone, galloping into the red gloom. Clara rode to the Dalton Ranch. The heat was a physical blow, the air thick and hard to breathe. Sarah Dalton, her face black with soot, was trying to force a dozen panicked horses into a lower pasture, away from the advancing flames. Clara did not hesitate. She rode into the smoke, her throat raw, her eyes streaming. She used the mare, her voice, and her own body to help Sarah turn the herd. The roar of the fire was a constant, deafening sound, like a freight train that would never pass. She breathed smoke until her lungs felt scorched, but she did not falter. She was no longer the woman who had shivered in the stagecoach. She was a woman of Wyoming, and she was fighting for her home. They got the last of the livestock moved just as the fire crested the ridge above the Dalton homestead. A solid wall of orange, 60 feet high. "To the river!" Sarah screamed. "It's the only safe place." Clara looked back, toward the Thorn Ranch. "Wade," she breathed. She rode. She found him in a scene from hell. The fire had already swept through. Elias Thorne's main house was gone, a smoking pile of rubble. The barn, however, was still standing, though flames licked at its western wall. Men were shouting, beating at the embers with wet sacks. Then she heard the scream. It was Sarah's son, Jamie, the boy she had comforted in the general store. He was 8 years old, and he had run back to the barn, trying to save his new puppy. Now he was trapped. A burning support beam had fallen, blocking the main door. The roof was groaning, ready to collapse. Elias Thorne was weeping, trying to claw at the burning wood. "My boy, Jamie!" Wade was there. He had been on the roof, trying to beat back the flames. He saw the situation in an instant. He saw the boy's small, terrified face in a gap in the wall. He saw the roof beam sag. He looked at Clara. Their eyes met across the smoking yard. He saw her terror. He thought of his brother, Jesse, and the promise he had made to himself. He would not run. He grabbed an axe. He did not try the main door. He ran to the side of the barn, to the collapsing wall. "Wade, no!" Clara screamed. He smashed through the burning planks. He disappeared into the inferno. The world stopped. Clara held her breath. The only sound was the roar of the fire and the awful, cracking groan of the barn's roof. 1 second, 2, an eternity. The roof collapsed. It fell inward with a sound like a giant sigh, sending a geyser of sparks and smoke into the red sky. "No!" Clara whispered, her knees giving way. "No! No!" Then, from the smoke, a figure emerged. It was Wade. He was blackened, his shirt smoking. He was half dragging, half carrying the crying, coughing boy. He shoved Jamie into Elias Thorne's arms and took 2 steps. Then he collapsed, face down, in the soot. They survived. The valley was scarred, blackened, and wounded. But the fire had been stopped at the river. Wade lay in their bed. He had not been burned, not badly, but the smoke had ravaged his lungs. He had breathed fire, and it had nearly killed him. For 2 days, he had coughed, a deep, agonizing, dry cough that shook the bed frame. He was covered in soot, not just on his skin, but in his mouth, in his nose. Clara sat beside him. She did not leave. She bathed him, cleaning the soot from his skin, revealing the man beneath. She held cool cloths to his face. She spooned water and broth between his cracked lips. On the 3rd day, the coughing eased. He was no longer fighting for every breath. He was just sleeping. He was exhausted, his body healing from the inside out. Clara lay down on the bed beside him, curling her body against his. She was careful of his sore ribs. She put her head on his uninjured shoulder, the one that did not bear Nathaniel's scar. The cabin was quiet. The world was quiet. The fire was gone. She breathed in his scent, what was left of it, beneath the smell of ash, that scent of pine and leather, the scent that meant safety. He had run into the fire. He had faced his own ghost, the ghost of his brother, of helplessness, and he had won. He had saved the boy. A wave of love, so powerful and so overwhelming it left her breathless, washed over her. It was not the fragile, questioning affection of their first months. It was not the desperate, clinging gratitude of her recovery. It was a love as vast and as wild as the land outside, a love that had been tested by violence and jealousy, and now by fire. She pressed her lips to his soot-stained neck. "I love you," she whispered, the words a truth she had been too afraid to say, even to herself. "Wade, I love you more than I feared I could." She thought he was asleep, but his hand, lying on the quilt, moved. His fingers fumbled, finding hers. A low chuckle, painful and rough, rumbled in his chest. He turned his head, his gray eyes opening, clear and full of a weary, profound tenderness. "Well," he rasped, his voice a ruin. "Size isn't everything, is it?" She stared at him. The words, their words, the sentence that had saved her. He had taken her greatest fear, her greatest shame, and turned it into the foundation of their life. He was using it now, not to challenge her, but to accept her love, to accept all of it. A laugh, a real, true laugh, bubbled up from her chest, bursting out through her tears. She cried, but it was a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. She laughed, burying her face in his neck. "No," she wept. "No, it isn't." She took his hand, the large, scarred hand that had saved her, that had saved a child, that had carved her a ring. She guided it, pressing his palm flat against her lower belly, just below her navel. She held it there. Wade's smile faded. His eyes, fixed on hers, widened. He was confused, then a dawning, a slow, impossible shock. His hand tensed under hers. He was feeling for something, a change, a newness. He looked at her, his throat working, unable to speak. Clara just smiled through her tears and nodded. They were expecting. The first snow of the next winter fell in early November. It was not a blizzard. It was a gentle, quiet fall of white. A promise of rest. The land, still blackened in patches from the fire, was covered in a blanket of clean, unmarked peace. Wade, his lungs healed, his strength returned, sat on his horse. Beside him, Clara sat on her mare. They were on the high ridge, the one where his parents were buried, the one that overlooked their valley. Their cabin was small, nestled in the aspen grove, a steady, brave curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The new barn, built by the men of the valley, stood strong beside it. Wade looked at Clara. She was bundled in her heavy coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. The small wooden ring was visible on her gloved hand. She was looking out at their land, her land, and her face was full of a peace that matched his own. The West was still cruel. The winters were still long, the land still unforgiving. But it was not a prison. It was not a place of exile. Wade. Clara. He reached out his gloved hand. She looked at him, her eyes shining, and placed her hand in his. They sat side by side, their horses breathing steam into the cold air, and looked down at their home. It was, Clara thought, home, because they had each other. Thank you for listening to this story from our studio. We hope you enjoyed the journey of Wade and Clara. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please let us know in the comments. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more original tales. And finally, we invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English. We read every comment. Thank you.